After the reception of my Cyberpunk photo mode tutorial, I received quite a few requests for a tutorial on Reshade, likely one of the most imperative tools for virtual photography. This video is going to focus mainly on the usage of Reshade within Cyberpunk 2077, but all of this information will translate directly into other games that support Reshade as well. First, I'll discuss Reshade and the installation process of said Reshade in order to get you set up before we move into the technical part of this video. Then, we'll talk the tools that I use in relation to virtual photography. This won't be a full breakdown of all the effects available within Reshade, as that is a monumental task considering how many are available. The tools I use primarily are Cinematic Depth of Field by Otis Inf and Real Long Exposure by Sir Cobra. And those are the tools that I'll go into depth on in relation to my personal photography methods. Then, I'll have a full example of my process at the very end. Apart from Reshade, all of this will take place within an unmodded installation to reduce any confusion. All links will be provided in the description. Reshade is a generic post-processing injector for games and video software. It's designed to allow users to implement or improve features that may or may not be available within the game that they're playing. This includes realistic depth of field, anti-aliasing, ambient occlusion, film grain, and much more. The installation of Reshade is simple. Navigate to reshade.me and click the download link on the front page. Run the reshade.exe file and navigate to your Cyberpunk installation, then hit Next. Cyberpunk uses DirectX 12, so use that and hit Next. In my installation, I'm going to be using Otis FX by Otis Inf and Cobra FX by Sir Cobra. I also added Quint by Marty McFly and Sweet FX by CJDK. These last two are not necessary for this tutorial, but they get your foot in the door for experimenting with tools outside of what I'll be demoing. Once all your selections are made, hit Next and all your selections will be downloaded and injected into Cyberpunk. That's it for installation. Now, time to boot up Cyberpunk. If all went smoothly, you should see a welcome tutorial in the top left of your screen, indicating that the tool is working. I would highly recommend engaging in the tutorial, as the tool can seem pretty overwhelming at first. Reshade is opened by pressing the Home key on your keyboard. If you have a 60% keyboard like I do, the shortcut function plus K will achieve the same effect. Once in game, the first thing we'll do is set an effects toggle key binding. Select the Settings tab within Reshade and bind whatever key suits you to the effects toggle at the top of the menu. This key will now enable and disable any effects that are currently active. We'll start with Cinematic Depth of Field, my daily driver in basically all of my photography. This is a very dynamic depth of field tool that I personally find very well done. Enable it by locating it in the list in the Home tab and ticking its box. If the autofocus does not kick in immediately, exit the menu, then toggle it on with your Effect Toggle keybind. Generally, Cinematic Depth of Field will be set up with basic settings out of the box. There's really no adjustment needed if you're just looking for basic depth of field. But let's start at the top. Autofocus should be left on for beginners. Adjusting the manual focus plane can be tedious, and unlikely necessary in most cases. Manual adjustment can be used if you want full control of the exact focus plane of your shots. Mouse-driven autofocus will override the autofocus point that is usually centered in the middle of your screen. It instead plants the point directly on top of your mouse. I disable this, as I don't want the focus point to be jumping around as I'm adjusting settings in photo mode. The autofocus point slider allows you to delicately manipulate where on the screen you want the focus to be centered. Drag either axis left or right to adjust it. The autofocus transition speed slider denotes how quickly the focus transitions between subjects that are close and far. I like using a slow transition when I personally make cinematic videos. The manual focus plane slider is only relevant if you don't have autofocus enabled. This can be used to affix the focal plane to a set distance regardless of where the autofocus point is. Focal length refers to how narrow or how wide the focus plane is. The longer the focal length, the narrower the depth of field, thus more is out of focus. The shorter the focal length, the wider the depth of field, with more being in focus. Aperture is similar to focal length in the way that it affects the amount of the shot that is actually in focus. A good way to visualize it is that focal length is like a wall of focus that can be thickened or thinned relative to the focal point, while aperture affects the amount of the shot that is actually able to be in focus. A high aperture of 22 allows everything to be in focus, while a low aperture centers focus around the focal point. If you're unsure, just experiment with these two settings and you'll get more of a feel for them over time. The focusing overlay section is used to edit the plain visualizer that appears when you adjust settings. There's really no reason to tweak these settings unless you want to customize the colors of these visualizers. The blur tweaking section is exactly what it describes. Here you can make changes to the blur, post focal length, and aperture adjustment. Far plane max blur is the factor that adjusts intensity of the blur beyond the focal plane, while near plane max blur adjusts the intensity of the blur behind the focal plane. Overall blur quality is quite system intensive. As the higher you go, the more passes the algorithm has to make to increase the overall quality of the blur. It does end up looking better, but it does sacrifice system performance. Bokeh busy factor determines how blobs of light will appear out of focus. A lower bokeh busy factor will make them appear much softer and smoother, while busier bokeh will crisp up the edges of the light. Post blur smoothing factor will apply a softer blur to out of focus objects. Near far plane distance compensation helps smooth hard edges that are just out of focus to give a more natural look to a photo. The last section I'll discuss here is highlight tweaking. Anamorphic factor adjusts the shapes of blobs of light that are out of focus. A value of 1 gives perfect circles, while a value of 0.1 will give flattened ellipses. Anamorphic spread factor adjusts just how much the out of focus light is stretched. Anamorphic alignment relates to the orientation of the bokeh effect if they are not perfect circles. A value of 0 will align all bokeh around the center of the screen, while a value of 1 will align all bokeh vertically. Highlight boost factor will boost or dim highlights a small amount. Highlight gamma factor can be used to even further boost or dim highlights in the photo. 2.2 is default natural colors. Highlight sharpening factor will further crisp up the edges of bokeh light blobs if you choose to do so. Highlight shape settings let you even further adjust the shape of the bokeh light blobs, but it's likely unnecessary for most usages. But for now, we're going to move into the explanation of real long exposure. This one is a much simpler tool, but probably equally as useful as cinematic depth of field, in my opinion. We're going to start as if we only have cinematic depth of field, and once we get that all sorted out, then we'll move on to actually using real long exposure. Like I said, it's a tool that is not very in-depth, but is extremely useful. And we can add that on at the end when we get our shot all lined up. One thing to note is that you're probably going to want to turn off the in-game vanilla depth of field. That really does mess with reshade, so we're just going to roll with reshade's capabilities here. So parroting what I said in my Cyberpunk photo mode full tutorial, in order to get an interesting shot, you want to make sure that you have a good light source. You want to make sure that the balance of the photo is actually good, so you don't want it heavily weighted with a subject on one side and a lot of blank space. You don't want a huge amount of headroom where there's just nothing going on. You just want to make the photo as interesting as possible to your best ability. The hard thing about photography is that you don't immediately have the eye for it until you spend a lot of time working on it. So same thing goes for virtual photography. If you spend a lot of time in it, you'll eventually get an eye for what you specifically like, and then you can go ahead and employ that. So I want to mess with the focal length and the aperture in order to get a pretty nice bokeh effect in the background. Generally 150 to 120 focal length is really good for close portraiture, because that gives you a really nice blurry background, but it doesn't blow out the bokeh in the back so much that it is distracting. The other thing is that aperture should remain at a good 2.8 to 4-ish if you want to get a good background blur. Generally, you can just experiment with these settings. They are not very strict. You can do whatever you want. It's about creative process. So do what you would like. What looks good to you? Focal length and aperture, probably the two most important things. I don't actually go outside of those settings very often, but if I have a lot more time, then I'll likely, mess around with the far plane max blur and things like that, just to make the photo really pop. In this one, we're just going to focus on focal length and aperture, and we'll just go from there. We're going to go ahead and move into the real long exposure. So Search for real long exposure, just like cinematic depth of field. You want to find it in your list, enable it, and that module should show up in the bottom section where your settings are. Real long exposure is pretty much just a tool to expose the frame that you want for a set amount of time to get rid of any anti-aliasing issues that currently exist. So you have a slider here. It starts at 12.9 seconds. I would say the best exposure time is probably about a minute if you're trying to nail the final shot. So this only works if the subject is completely frozen. If there's any movement, then the frame is going to expose any movement, and that movement is going to make the image blurry, and it's not going to look good. So first thing you want to do is set a key binding for real long exposure here. Setting up a key binding means you don't have to dive back into the menu and actually manually click the start exposure. You can just click a key on your keyboard, and then this green circle will show up and show you how much longer is left for the exposure of the image. Something to remember is that if you have the photo mode cursor on your screen while you're exposing, that will be exposed within the image. So the best thing to do is, if you have a mod that can disable the photo mode cursor, turn the cursor off or just hide it in the corner of your screen and crop the image later in order to not expose the cursor, because that can be pretty distracting and it's probably not something you want in your photo. So the other settings like show progress, show green dot on finish, those are just some quality of life things. If you want to know when it's going to finish, keep that show progress tab on. That'll give you that little green circle, and then you can just watch it and wait for it to finish. Show green dot on finish. I haven't really used this. It's probably not very necessary. It's just an indicator that the exposure is done. The ISO, gamma, and delay sliders are ones that I don't really use, but I can explain them to you. So ISO is essentially going to imitate the sensitivity of a sensor on a camera. So if you have 1600 ISO, it's going to take in more light over time, and it could eventually blow out the light in your image. So generally I just leave this at the default setting because I don't really want to manipulate the light at all. I just want the average of everything over that period of time. Gamma is just going to kind of blow out the colors of the highlights over that exposed time, and that can be nice for some artsy photos. I don't really use it. And then delay is just how long it takes before the exposure actually starts, depending on when you strike your keybind. So if you have something specific you want to do with the exposure, you can totally delay it, but these last 3 bits are not super duper necessary, and you can always change the gamma and stuff in cinematic depth of field. So once you're ready to take your photo and you are ready to strike your real long exposure, go ahead and do that. Now we'll just sit here and wait while the system exposes that frame for the amount of time that you set. And this is going to help with hair mostly. Cyberpunk has a really bad issue with anti-aliasing as far as the hair goes in the game. So this really helps iron out the kind of blurry, grainy effect that just happens to be present around characters in this game. So here we have a before photo. This is before we exposed the photo for about a minute. So as you can see, there's like a graininess around the hair. Generally, it's mostly the hair that is very affected by the engine's limitations here. And here we have the after photo. There's a lot less distracting jagged edges. Hair just looks more clean. The outside of the character just looks tidier. And it just really meshes everything together in a really nice kind of cinematic way. So reshade is a hell of a lot more than just depth of field and exposure. There are so many tools that are available by so many amazing authors, and they keep being updated, and reshade is still very much very relevant for virtual photography. So that pretty much wraps up my reshade tutorial / explanation / demo. But all in all, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again.